Good evening. Good evening, everybody. My name is Philip Kennedy. I'm sure I've introduced myself to many of you before. I direct the public program of the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute. And before I introduce our very distinguished speaker for this evening, there are just a couple of things I wanted to mention. One is that a lot of you might have been here because of the shared interest at a talk we hosted here a month ago. Shireen Hamdi from Brown University, who's an anthropologist, came and talked about organ transplant, Islam and human dignity in Egypt. And so I'm sure there's a continuity between that event and tonight's event. She was talking much more from the perspective of anecdotes. She's a sociologist, so it was really about the way people make up their own minds about the ethics of organ transplant. I think tonight's discussion will be slightly more philosophical, coming from a bioethicist. The other thing is our speaker, Dr. Arthur Caplan, comes from the NYU Medical Center, which is something that's been on our minds. I think I mentioned this back in January at an event, that it was one of the divisions or the schools of NYU that suffered the most. Actually, it suffered quite severe damage, multi-million dollars worth of damage during the aftermath, or during Sandy and the aftermath of Sandy. And that's material damage, but it's also a lot of the damage that was done is irreplaceable damage, which is the worst part, research that got lost. But it's on our mind somehow if one belongs to the NYU community. So the fact that we have a speaker from the Langone school somehow makes us feel that if you can afford to come here, things are getting better. That's the hope. So let me introduce Dr. Caplan. He is the Doctors William F. and Virginia Connolly Mitty Professor and Head of the Division of Bioethics at New York University Langone Medical Center in New York City. And prior to coming to NYU, he was the Emanuel and Robert Hart Professor of Bioethics and Director of the Center of Bioethics at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Caplan also taught at the University of Minnesota, the University of Pittsburgh, and Columbia University, where I believe he got his PhD, or certainly studied there. He was the Associate Director for some time of the Hastings Center, which is a bioethics not-for-profit institution from 1984 to 1987. He is certainly among the most renowned thinkers in bioethics today, contributing to both academic and public discourse through his many publications. He served as chair of the advisory committee to the United Nations on human cloning, the chair of National Cancer Institute Biobanking Ethics Working Group. I think I got the rhythm not quite right there. He's part of the Special Advisory Committee to the International Olympic Committee on Genetics and Gene Therapy, and among other arrows in his quiver, he's the ethics advisor he acts as ethics advisor to the Department of Defense and the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. He's the author or editor of 25 books and over 550 papers, which is extraordinary. Writes a regular column on bioethics for MSNBC.com. He's one of the 10 most influential people in science, according to Discover magazine, and the recipient of many awards, including the McGovern Medal of the American Medical Writers Association and the Franklin Award from the city of Philadelphia. Dr. Caplan, it's a great pleasure to invite you to the podium.
Well, I deeply regret that my mother was not here for that introduction, but I'll accept it. It's a great privilege to come to NYU Abu Dhabi. I have had some discussions during the extensive 6-month period I've been at NYU with people who work here, teach here, do some of the administrative work, and I've had a chance now to visit with some people, not as many as I would like, but it's a real pleasure to see the enthusiasm of the faculty, the administration working closely to build and grow the institution, and the students very, very enthusiastic, very smart, very bright. So I'll be able to bring back a wonderful picture of NYU Abu Dhabi to the sunken, swampy remains of the medical school. It really was damaged badly. We suffered billions not millions, billions of dollars of damage due to the hurricane, which took water from the East River and pushed it up onto First Avenue into the 3 hospitals that we run. And one of them, the Veterans Hospital, is not back yet. It's still closed. I don't think it's going to come back till June. The other 2 are back, and we had some very fascinating ethics issues, which someday I'll come back and talk to you about, in terms of how to evacuate people, who would go first. I'll give you an example of something we learned. I thought, well, we'll take the sickest people out. They'll go first. And I learned during our evacuation of the hospital that we couldn't take the sickest people out because they required too many people to go with them. We actually had to take the healthy people out first, who didn't require as many nurses and doctors to accompany them. So the last people who came out were the people who were the sickest, which is counterintuitive, but it turns out that's how you have to allocate your personnel. One other lesson I learned was that people can go down 30 flights of stairs carrying a baby on a plastic sled and not damage themselves or the baby, which, having looked at the plastic sleds a few times, I would have thought was impossible. But you literally have stairs in the dark, and you drag the sled down the stairs. It goes bang, bang, bang. But the thing is built so well that the shocks are not transmitted to the person. So we had neonates, 30 weeks, 28 weeks, come down the stairwells. It was quite a thing to see. And even ethically, we got into some funny fights. I was there giving ethics advice that no one was paying any attention to, but trying to man my post. And I learned during the evacuation too that sometimes you have to bend the rules, because occasionally somebody would say, so Art, could you help us bag this patient, meaning help artificially ventilate somebody? Everybody kind of had to pitch in during this kind of a catastrophe. So even if you weren't totally trained in the skills, you might have to go in there. I did not have the heart or the nerve to tell some of the poor patients that I had no idea what I was doing and had never done it before, but I was what they had. Now, there's nothing worse than finding out when you're very ill that a philosopher is about to save your life. It's just not what you want to hear. So I didn't tell them. They didn't hear it. In any event, so that's been a major role for us. And by the way, future topic we could do here, and certainly are going to try and do there, because I've already arranged on October 29th of this year to hold a meeting on the lessons, ethical lessons of Sandy for healthcare in New York. But the whole question of what does the healthcare system have to do in a world of changing climate and global warming and more storms and catastrophes is a very interesting public policy, international policy challenge. So I've already started whispering in the ear of some of the students that that might be a problem that would be very important to work internationally in a nice project that maybe NYU Abu Dhabi would be a great place to also discuss some of those questions. So there are many, many lessons, important ones that we took away from this. Oh, and I'll tell you one other story, as long as I'm babbling about stories. Some of you know that we have a contract and run Bellevue Hospital in New York, which is a huge 1,000-bed plus facility. It's one of the biggest hospitals in the world. In the spirit of taking advantage of a problem, or if you will, turning lemons into lemonade, one of the things we did was when Bellevue was closed, they actually took out the entire ventilation system and replaced it. Now, you might say, why are we so prone to getting infections in hospitals? Because you can never close the hospital to pull out the entire ventilation system. So gunk, bugs, which we'll hear about later in this talk, build up there. And we had an opportunity here to pull out the entire thing. So we now have one of the safest facilities reopened in the world because the air is again clean. I think the air was last clean in Bellevue in about 1887. So it is now restored to its pristine state yet again. So there are some things that you can take advantage of and need to think about even when a disaster strikes. Some creative planning and some fast thinking were much in evidence there. All right, so let me get past that and get into tonight's topic, which is synthetic biology and the issue about should we create new life forms, new living things. This carries an enormous set of ethical questions with it. I'm not going to make you wait. I'm going to tell you or make an argument tonight that I think the answer to that question is yes. It is permissible, and I'll try and defend the case for making new life forms. I think many of them will bring great benefit, and there are problems and challenges, but I think we can manage. I'm also going to try and make a point tonight that oftentimes people worry that our ethical thinking around the world can't keep up with the science and the technology, that we're always catching up. We hear about Dolly the sheep being cloned, and then we start an ethics discussion. And we get blamed a lot in the bioethics business for being behind. I don't think that's true. I think when bioethics works well, it works very closely with scientists, very closely with doctors, tries to establish what's going on at the cutting edge and thinks about it. And in this area, that actually has been going on. If there is a gap, it is not from ethics. It is actually from politics, which is a separate challenge and problem. Politicians may not want to try and get into controversial topics. Politicians may decide they're not sure yet how they want to legislate, but it's not because ethicists haven't said, here are the issues, here's what you need to think about. And I'll use this case area of synthetic biology to show you what I mean. At the end, I'm going to, just so you don't think ethicists bless everything that scientists do, I'm going to tell you an area where I don't think we should do something, and that is bringing back to life extinct species or extinct early antecedents of us, Neanderthals. Part of the tricks of synthetic biology might lead us to be able to bring back to life animals that have long since gone extinct or our forebears. And I don't think that's such a great idea, and I'll try and explain why I don't like that particular application. Well, in getting into this, I have to say that I don't have any financial conflict of interest about this talk. Now, this is a slide that by the time we're done introducing bioethics into NYU Abu Dhabi, every single faculty member will have this slide. This slide is one of the major achievements of bioethics. We all now stand up and pronounce that we are not receiving money from anyone who could exert undue influence on the content of what we say. However, I am available for conflict of interest, so if someone wants to, no, I'm not, it's just. So, what is synthetic biology? Well, let me start by saying, all of you, of course, know exactly where your genes are, right? Do you? Somebody, anybody? I once asked this question of the Pennsylvania legislature, the state legislature, and about half of the legislators told me their genes were in their gonads, which seemed frightening to me, until the other half said that they thought their genes were in their brains, which seemed impossible to me, actually. So, knowing the Pennsylvania legislature as I do, I didn't think that was quite possible. But your genes, as we know, are in all the cells of our body, right? The full set, except in our gonads, which sperm and egg only have half, so they can recombine. And there are a few oddball cells in our body, extra credit, that don't have any DNA. Red blood cells, for example, which is ironic because that's, of course, in all the television shows what the police try to collect immediately. Be better off collecting spit or skin or something, but nonetheless, our genes are in every cell of our body. So that gives us an opportunity to wonder and think about what would we be able to do if we could understand those genes. And as some of you, I think, know, we've had a major push over the past 20 to 25 years to try and decode the human genome, or sometimes called map it. Some of you have heard of that project to map the human genome. So what does that mean? One way to think about it is, before we got molecular techniques that let us look at the human genome, we were looking at chromosomes. So those are the big units that carry genes in the nucleus of the cell. And there may be thousands and thousands of genes on every particular chromosome. And what we could see might be the equivalent of looking at an encyclopedia and seeing whether a volume was missing, or one was duplicated, or one was torn or damaged. That's about the level of precision we had with chromosomal analysis. But when we began to figure out techniques that let us, if you will, look at letter by letter what the actual genetic messages are, gene by gene on a chromosome, what we were able to do was open the book of the encyclopedia and look at the text. What we don't have yet, and we still don't really have it all the way, is the dictionary. So a lot of the work that's being done now is by associations. Some of you know we have a test for breast cancer. A certain gene sequence exists, and whenever it appears, it indicates in the woman who has it that she is at higher risk of getting breast cancer. Other gene sequences associate with other diseases, and it's easier to see diseases than it is normal traits because they're typos. Many traits like height or intelligence or even our immune system, they're going to have many, many genes contributing. It's hard to see, but if you get a mistake, it's easier to see what the misprint is and then say, oh, that leads to a disease or an impairment. So that's why you're seeing sort of a test announced kind of once a month or once every few months that says, here's a new association, we now have a test for Alzheimer's disease or risk of diabetes or whatever it is, but they're easier to find than some of the more complex but normal traits. So humans, as humans always do, we think that the way to improve our health, improve the world, is to understand our genes. Of course it's our genes. We're the most important species. We control all the other species. Half the time we're trying to wipe out or kill the other species inadvertently or by pollution or expansion into their environments. But we're kind of the king of the hill when it comes to genetics. So we spend an inordinate amount of time trying to figure out our genes. To put it another way, we just love ourselves. It's our genes, we love them, we have to understand them. That's the key to understanding everything. That turns out to be a little bit of an error. Our genes are complicated. If you want to do experiments on our genes, there's a certain hindrance in the fact that you might kill someone if you do experiments on their genes. Putting genes into cells, inserting things could make for trouble. But there are many other living things around us, and some of them are pretty simple. Viruses, bacteria. And it turns out it's easier to understand a simple system than a complex one. Moreover, viruses and bacteria, they don't see the world as run by humans. They just see us as dinner. Flu likes us. Smallpox loves us. Pneumonia is our friend. So there are many ailments, diseases that are viral and bacteria that are just important to our health. We don't have to fix us. We might try to understand the agent that's attacking us. And this turns out to be true for many parts of the world. The giant whale, what does it eat? Tiny little crustacean-like creatures, plankton. Many things feed on algae in a lake or a pond. Well, these are much more simple systems. And if we could understand them, we could do a lot of change in the world. You can kill a lot of algae in trying to genetically engineer it. Nobody cares. There aren't protests. Nobody worries about it ethically too much. If you try to genetically manipulate children for a while to see if you can make them healthier and you kill a few, people get more disturbed. So it's a little easier to work with the bacteria and the viruses than it is us. You can try more drastic changes, more radical experiments, and the systems are simpler. In a certain way, that's the key to understanding synthetic biology. If you're a scientist, it's the microbiologist's revenge. After years of neglect, these little creatures turn out to be things that are very important to study, understand, and much easier to manipulate. So microbial engineering, trying to strip genes out of viruses and bacteria and see what happens, minimal genomics, transferring genes from one virus to another, gene transfer type work, and literally trying to create gene sequences to see whether you could make something come alive by building up a new genome. That's synthetic biology. Everybody follow that? So it's basically manipulating simple systems of genes Sometimes you're just trying to tweak something that's already there by substituting one gene. You might actually try to build a whole genome using a type of a genealyzer machine to spit out code and put it into a cell type environment and see if you can make the thing divide and replicate and use energy and excrete and do other things that indicate it's alive. So all of these things fall into the heading of synthetic biology. So what are the key challenges facing synthetic biology? Well, the good part is synthetic biology could be used to do a lot of work, for one thing. If you have a bug and you engineer it, you might allow it to make products, chemicals, proteins that are very useful for our purposes. You could make drugs, teaching a bacteria to secrete certain things. You can teach a virus to carry something into the body and maybe wipe out fatty deposits in your blood vessels. You might be able to make a bug that has a real affinity for eating plastic, get at ocean pollution. You might be able to engineer a bug that loves to make algae-like substances that animals can eat, help doing farming fish, cleaner, less polluting animal feeds. Many, many great options in using synthetic biology to create bugs and viruses that would produce or work as little factories for us. And when I was introduced, it was said I was working with the Defense Department in the United States and the Defense Advanced Research Project Administration, which is the spookier science part of the Defense Department, spy-like things. But some of the things they do are just trying to figure out, can you clean off a ship by making a bug that would get rid of the rust? That would be very, very valuable instead of lugging the thing up into dry dock or trying to find cleansers that wouldn't pollute the oceans. If we go out on a cruise ship and it dumps its waste, is there some way we could have bacteria or viruses engineered to make that waste less polluting? It may even be possible to take engineered bugs and send them into nuclear power plants that are loaded with radiation and have them eat the radiation, incorporate it into themselves, and make it easier to dispose of than trying to send people in to get fueling rods and other things that are highly dangerously radioactive. So without going completely off the wall, the benefits inherent in synthetic biology are enormous. They stand ready by engineering these tiny critters to help us with pollution, energy, health, manufacturing chemicals, short-circuiting long chemical processes that could be wired into a bug and have it done much more quickly. Some of that's already going on. There actually are some products made from synthetic biology. There are a few pairs of waterproof pants out there now that use proteins and chemicals made by synthetically engineered microbes. So you could buy certain products now that have outcomes. To put it another way, I suspect if we were looking at where mapping genes is going to have the most immediate payoff, it will have a payoff in humans in terms of genetic testing. It's not going to have a payoff in humans anytime soon in trying to do gene therapy or genetic engineering in a serious way because the system is complicated that we have and dangerous to try and do experiments. Engineering the bugs, engineering the tiny microbes is a much more interesting shortcut to get to the same result frequently. So very, very big benefits. I can say ethically, I think the potential here is so big that it would take an enormously powerful set of arguments not to proceed to try and engineer life forms that never existed before. Remember these creatures I'm talking about changing their genes or building genes up in a small set of genes to put into a bacteria whose own genes have been taken out to turn it into a different thing. We're making new life. Some people are going to say, too risky, too dangerous, ethically inherently wrong. So before I get to that, I've told you the technology now. You have an understanding of what it might be that synthetic biologists would do and how they might work to change microbes and make new kinds of them or entirely never seen viruses and bacteria. These do raise ethical questions. One set of questions is up there, environmental impact. What if one of these little engineered things got out of the NYU Abu Dhabi lab and began to run around through the sewer system downtown? And all of a sudden, what was supposed to eat the plastic that had gotten into garbage in a particular place is now eating your cups in your house. Don't want it there. How do we know it's not going to go someplace where we don't want it, this newly created thing? Who's going to own the thing? If you make these little bugs, are you going to be able to patent them, patent life forms, and say, if you want to get it, you have to pay a license or a fee to get it? How are we going to know who's going to get the benefits from synthetic biology? There are plenty of places in the world that would benefit from having things that could make fuels or eat pollution or help with our health by eating nasty things out of us or fighting viruses and bacteria that we don't want in our bodies. Could be costly. How do we know that the poor or people in other situations won't be able to get access to these benefits? Those are important issues. I'm going to tell you tonight, I don't really think they're obstacles in any serious way to moving ahead with synthetic biology. I think each one of them can be handled. The other set of issues is who's watching this technology, and can we trust nationally or internationally that somebody has their eye on things so that nobody makes a bug, let's say, that is a weapon. Because you can make bugs that are friendly, but you can make bugs that are meaner. If you don't like the flu that's going around, remember we were all worried about swine flu? Well, you could make an even nastier, more contagious flu and use that against others. It's even possible you might be able to concoct viruses and bacteria for which we don't have any antidotes. So there's a downside and a risk, and who's watching that and who's holding the scientists accountable that they don't do that kind of work? And is it right to make these new things in the spirit of an argument that some of you have heard? How many of you heard the argument, we shouldn't do things where we're playing God? You heard that claim before? We shouldn't play God with nature. We shouldn't go out there and make new things because that's not our job. We're supposed to accept gifts from God or the divinity or the deity, or if you prefer, the luck of nature, if that's your worldview, and we don't try to go out there and muck around with it. Part of the reason we don't do that is we shouldn't play God because we find out time and time again, we think we know what we're doing and we screw it up. Part of the reason we shouldn't do it is it's just arrogant. We shouldn't make new living things. That's not our job. So that may be a more serious argument, and we'll come back to that one later. Well, remember I said I wanted to say a word. This is just me being irritated about bioethics getting a hard time. I've told you about this new technology. You're starting to know that there's something called synthetic biology out there. Well, the question is, in answering some of those questions, is science always getting so far ahead that by the time we start having this ethics discussion, we can't even keep up? Well, in the case of synthetic biology, the answer is no. So one of the things that I can tell you about synthetic biology is that the first paper raising some of the questions about safety, environmental impact, the use of synthetic biology to make weapons, the use of synthetic biology in terms of patenting and ownership was written in 1999. I know this because I wrote it. It appeared in Science. A group of people, both ethicists and theologians from different religious backgrounds, wrote a paper in Science back in 1999 on the ethics of basically synthetic biology. And in 1999, what did we say were big issues? We said in that paper, got to start worrying about the misapplication of synthetic biology for creation of biological weapons or use in terrorism. Got to worry about the environmental impact of things getting out into places they shouldn't be. We have to worry about whether these creatures are really safe for us. Could they do harm that we don't really understand if we ate them or breathe them? We have to worry about who owns it and making sure that people get fair access to things. We have to worry also about human hubris and arrogance and thinking that it's okay for us to make new living things, the playing God argument. In 1999, we were pretty smart, because every one of the issues we identified in that paper still remains a core issue in thinking about the ethics of synthetic biology today. The problem has been that it has been very difficult in 1999 to get politicians at the World Health Organization, at the UN, in the American Congress to pay any attention. The technology was so new, no one is doing anything. You're saying, well, you know, there are ethical things to worry about 10 years ago, and people are like, I got plenty of things to worry about that are happening right now as a politician or a bureaucrat. I don't care about something that hasn't happened yet. That's not ethics failure, that's policy failure, and it happens a lot. The ethicists, both religious and more secular ones, when we got together and wrote that paper, we said, pay attention now. There are really some emerging issues that the world should start to think through before this technology gets too far down the road. Well, the world chose not to do that. What really has gotten the world paying attention is, you may know that some scientists, people like Craig Venter, have announced that they have taken genes out of a bacteria. They have made genes in their lab and put it into the bacteria from which the native genes were taken out, and the thing came alive. And so we have made a new living creature. Anybody remember the announcements last scientists make new life forms? That got people's attention, but that was 18 months ago. Before that happened, people just were sort of like, well, you know, call me when that bug gets in my bathtub. Other than that, I got bigger things to worry about before that. So we do have a policy issue before us. Do we have the right forums? Do we have the right leaders? Do we have the right interaction with the science community, the medical community, to get on top of challenging technology before some crisis or fear or worry happens and then things become very sticky? I don't think we do yet, but we can come back to that in the question and answer. So I said before, coming back to the issues, why aren't I worried about the environment? Because I think that can be handled through adequate regulation, what I'll call branding, which I'll explain in a minute, holding people liable for damage they do, and by labeling things, which I'll explain. Environmental impact is a problem, but I think there are ways to regulate and minimize any potential danger of synthetic biology microbes to the environment. The health impact, safety, I also think can be regulated and enforced if we choose to set up the right system so that no one is damaged by inadvertently swallowing or drinking or breathing a genetically engineered creature. Justice questions about patents and ownership, they're important, but they're not unique here. We have this question all the time about new drugs, new medicines. Some of you know today India announced it was not going to honor the Novartis patent on the cancer drug Gleevec. There was a Me Too version of that drug, and they said, no, you can't patent the slightly changed version and extend your patent protection because people in India need access to that cancer treatment. So that's a fight about ownership and patenting and control, where the Indian government basically said, access demands that we not give you an extension on your patent. That's not unique to synthetic biology. It happened today with a drug. So that issue is important, and we'll see what courts and patent attorneys and international policy wants to do about ownership, but it's not, whatever the answer is, it's not a synthetic biology problem. It's just synthetic biology is going to be governed by decisions about commerce and ownership and patents more generally. So in a sense, those issues become political, not ethics. So let me explain. Here's a worry pulled out of a recent article. No one understands the risks that synthetic organisms pose to the environment. Unlike transgenic crops, for those of you who follow this, that means genetically modified food. Synthetic microbes will be altered in a more sophisticated and fundamentally different way, making them potentially more difficult to regulate, manage, and monitor. That's an assertion, I'm not sure it's true, but that is the kind of worry that people have when they say, well, if you're going to make new life forms, how do we know what the impact is going to be of those critters on the environment? How do we know they're going to stay where you want them to stay? That's what we're talking about with environmental challenge. More threatening issues. Misuse for weapons. As I said, we could make some pretty nasty diseases using synthetic biology, new life forms that aren't nice to us. One of the interesting areas that's emerging is, believe it or not, by the time the next class is admitted to NYU Abu Dhabi, somebody is going to say, oh, you should take me at the school because I've made an interesting new life form in my garage. The techniques for doing this are getting simpler and simpler. The machinery is getting more and more available. You don't have to be at MIT or EMBO or other science organizations to do some interesting synthetic biology work. There are people submitting synthetic biology creations at science fairs already. So there's always the potential we could have a lot of rules, but if some enterprising young person decides to make a bug in their basement and it literally does get out, or the dog eats it and then spreads it around, these are bad things. So that's a real problem. Accidents by amateurs, people trying to do innovative things, and at least in the American context, I'm not sure it's true quite as much around the rest of the world, Americans love amateur science, right? We think, oh yeah, it's great to give NIH grants to people like the provost here to do cutting edge genomic work. But actually, Thomas Edison, nobody gave him a grant. He was in his lab in New Jersey and he invented the light bulb. And actually, didn't Bill Gates build a computer in his garage? And didn't Steve Jobs come up with ideas for, we like the idea that rugged individuals can go out there and invent and find things and do things. They don't even have to go to college. They don't even have to go to high school. I don't know how they're doing this stuff. They read a comic book and they make it in the basement. It's some kind of miraculous inference process. So we tend not to want to say, gee, maybe we shouldn't send the equipment to Fred Smertz at 109 Smith Street and let him have at it in his garage. There's a strong view, and it's partly reinforced in the computer side by hackers and amateurs to say, hey, yeah, synthetic biology, let's let kids fool around with that too. So tougher to regulate because we, at least in the States, there's a kind of admiration for the entrepreneurial young person to try things out. And I mentioned the playing God argument. One example of what it means to be arrogant is to say, you know, a lot of animals and plants have gone extinct. Since we can engineer genes, why don't we rebuild their genes and bring them all back to life? We can have a much more interesting garden at NYU Abu Dhabi if we have a woolly mammoth there and a carrier pigeon and a dodo bird and a few extinct tiny dinosaurs, not too mean. So wouldn't that be interesting? One of the things I've learned about this argument about playing God, I've come to think that it is not the God part that makes people worry, it's the playing part. God actually understood that when humans got to Earth, they were going to muck around with it. So far, all the major religions and moral arguments accept the idea of agriculture, right? Nobody said, oh, you can't breed animals and you can't grow crops. That's changing the way things are. You can't domesticate animals and have them for your use. Most of the religions of the world would say, God made the world for our dominion. What doesn't excite people is to find out that scientists somewhere are saying, hey, wouldn't it be cool to make a woolly mammoth? I don't know why we need that, but it would just be kind of fun, huh? What do you think? Or Craig Ventnor saying, I don't really need to make a brand new life form, but I think I'll just screw around with it and scare the crap out of everybody. It's the playing part that bothers people. It seems irresponsible. It seems, if you will, disrespectful. It's not the God part. God was pretty good about saying, you know, I give you this planet and work it and be fruitful with it and figure out ways to extract its resources. Playing with it, I don't know. So I happen to think, and we'll come back to this too, that it's the playing part of playing God that is more interesting than it is being arrogant and God-like as an argument. So what if some people said about what ethical stance we should take regarding synthetic biology with respect to all these questions? One school of thought, which I will identify here as the incorrect European position, is to take the precautionary principle and use that approach. The other school of thought, which I will dub Caplan's correct moral stance, reasonable prudence, and I'll explain what that is. But let's take a look at the precautionary principle. What that says is, if an action or innovation, mainly in science and technology, has a risk of causing harm to the public or the environment, then the total burden of proof that it is not harmful before you do it falls on those who propose to do it. So, to put it simply, if you want to do an experiment and it has some risk of harming the environment or harming people, then the people who say don't do it have nothing to prove. You have to prove that there's not going to be any harm. Well, that would be nice if we could do that, but almost every intervention and experiment does carry risk. That there are experiments because if we knew what we were doing, we'd do it. When you're experimenting, you're not sure exactly what might happen. So there's always some risk. If you take the precautionary principle and apply it to synthetic biology, the talk ends here because you can't meet this standard. I can't tell you that nothing would ever escape. I can't tell you that no one would ever inhale something that might hurt them. I can't tell you that every single step we might take to minimize risk will get rid of all risk. And some would say, well, if you can't tell me that, then you shouldn't do it. I think that's too high a bar. Everybody follow that argument? So it's sort of, if I can't guarantee safety, guarantee it, then I can't do it. And I don't think that's the right attitude. If we took that attitude in medical research, we also would have to stop. It's too high a bar. When we try new drugs, when we try new vaccines, there is risk. Sometimes people get sick. Occasionally and rarely they die. We try to minimize that risk, but we don't follow that principle in biomedical research. If we did, we couldn't do any. So what's an alternative to the precautionary principle? I'm going to propose reasonable prudence. And what does that mean? Well, for prudent, what we want to do is make sure that someone is giving oversight to the technology or the new innovation, synthetic biology in this case, to minimize risk. We want to be transparent. What's going on? Who's regulating it? What are the rules? What's happening? The scientists or technologists who do synthetic biology should be accountable for what they do, meaning even to legal penalties or fines if things go wrong, or the damage they do, they will be held accountable to pay. And control over the information, which scientists love. The notion that somebody might tell them you can't publish the dangerous instructions about how to make a nasty microbe in a journal because we shouldn't publish that sort of thing. A lot of scientists say, wait a minute, you're telling me I don't have free speech? I can't say what I want? Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, we might say that. So part of the way to protect against harm is to control who gets the technology. Maybe not every junior high kid is going to get shipped to him the synthetic biology kit. Maybe the science fair won't accept as a submission synthetic biology. Too risky, not going to do it. Some of you don't know this, but in the States a few years ago we stopped allowing high school kids to submit to science fairs and award contests animal experiments. Too much harm done to the animals. They just took it out. The kids didn't know how to do humane treatment of the animals and they were hurting them. So we could do the same here if we chose and say you can't, we're going to try and diminish that risk by certain kinds of restriction. The US has a President's Council on Bioethics. It actually is chaired by Amy Gutman, my former president at Penn, friend of mine, and they wrote a report last year and they said, you know, we're finally paying attention to synthetic biology. The Obama administration asked them to write a report. When Craig Venter made his new creepy living thing, it got everybody's attention. I was still angry that they hadn't looked at our paper from 10 years before, but all right. But they did cite it frequently in the report, so that was good. But they finally got around to paying attention to this, and they said, well, we don't think anything's required right now with respect to synthetic biology except telling the government to pay attention to it. That was the bottom line. Keep an eye on this. I don't think that's enough. I think at this point in time, given where synthetic biology is, given what benefits it holds, and given the fact that we're really starting to do synthetic biology, we need to move not just to government attention, but to what I'll call that reasonable prudence. We need to set up some systems to do this. So what am I talking about? For one thing, if you all here are going to trust this technology, synthetic biology, and say we want those benefits, make fuels, clean up pollution, get rid of diseases in our body, make more low-polluting food substances for animals and fish and so on to eat, and that we could expand our agriculture all over the world using such things, then you have to believe that someone is in charge and has authority over synthetic biology, and that some agency is responsible for making sure that whatever environmental rules or whatever rules are put on this, they're being followed. So the question today is, what agency has responsibility over synthetic biology in the US or anywhere? And you are all correct. Nobody. So we're sitting in a situation where in the States, to give you an example, is the Food and Drug Administration watching synthetic biology? Is the Environmental Protection Agency? Is the Forestry and Wildlife Group? Who is it? EPA? Who's watching this thing? Well, actually, they're passing the technology back and forth right now. The only group that really can say we're paying close attention that I know of is the Department of Defense. And while I'm helping them, that's not who you want. They have their own agenda. It's not regulatory, shall we say. So I think we need to say, both in the US and worldwide, who has responsibility here? Who's watching this technology? We haven't said it yet. That's an area of policy that we have to get very clear about if people are not going to treat this like they did GMO or other, well, let's use genetically modified food and say, I don't know who's setting the safety standards, I don't know who's in charge, who's watching this thing. Duty to identify. If you're going to have new life forms, I think every one of them should have something that Americans will laugh about, a brand, like cattle. In the old Wild West of the United States, when cattle people trotted around their cattle, they tried to put a brand on them with a hot iron so they could say, that's mine. There are ways to mark synthetic organisms. You can watermark them or brand them, putting little chemical messages into your new life form that says, this thing, I made it and it's mine. That both allows you to say, oh, that's not a mutated one, that's a synthetic one. And if the amateurs don't do it, they can get in a lot of trouble for not watermarking or branding their life form. Liability for escape and any harm done is helped because you can say, oh, that's your bug that ran out there and did that pollution or infected a natural strain of bacteria and caused harm. And detection of rogue bugs that terrorists or amateurs might make is facilitated. So one obvious thing to do is to try and require some form of identification. Another way to keep this technology in check, make sure that all the organisms you make have a duty to die. What I mean by that is you can engineer into every new synthetic life form a limit on its lifespan. You can make it frail so that it can't live in many environments except the one that you want it to work in, if you will. And you make sure that you engineer a message into the life form that says, after X amount of time, you're going to fall apart. It's a very good way to ensure safety. Make sure that the thing isn't that tough, can't live in your gut, can't live on the stage, and make sure that it has some kind of internal mechanism, which we can engineer into life forms, so that it will not be able to reproduce itself. By the way, that idea came from Monsanto. they made something called the Terminator gene years ago because they wanted to make sure that farmers kept back and bought more of their genetically engineered seeds. So they made sure that the seeds died. I'm not sure that's the best use of the technology, but I like it over here as a way to make things safer. Control of information. So, what do we publish? Who gets trained? Who gets to know things? Is there a case to censor? Some of you know, there was a big debate not too long ago about should we publish the information about how to make a nastier form of the flu in Science and Nature, big, major, the most preeminent science journals. Teams in Wisconsin and the Netherlands had come up with ways to tweak the flu virus to make it both more contagious and nastier, more likely to kill you. They weren't doing this for fun and they weren't playing. What they were trying to understand is what are the natural mutations that we should watch for to say that's getting more contagious in nature or that's getting more lethal. So it was done with a purpose. But the issue arose, should they publish this? One response that came up in this debate, which I got to get involved in, was to make this point. One of the scientists said, look, if you're going to try and censor, once some laboratories with postdoctoral fellows and students have the information, it's impossible to keep the details secret. Who's going to decide which scientists are allowed to get dangerous information? Who do you want to say can't publish your most interesting scientific results? It's going to stifle scientific careers. If you can't share information, how are we going to make advances in fighting these diseases, even if we don't intend to make nastier life forms? So the idea of censorship in many quarters went over like a lead balloon. However, there was another problem. By the time a scientist has submitted a paper to Nature or Science or the New England Journal, how many people do you think have seen that paper behind the scenes? A lot. Many. Peer reviewers. Everybody in the lab. Probably the friends of the scientist have taken a look. A lot of people have seen this paper. When they're sending it around for review or just for comments, are they encrypting it? No. Actually, any 11-year-old who's a pretty good hacker could find the secret formula to making a flu virus meat nastier. It's already out there. If we're going to talk control of information, we're going to have to go upstream, set a responsibility ethos in courses here at NYU and other places about what scientists should do in thinking about what's responsible to put on paper. We're going to have to try and get upstream in the funding so that maybe only certain institutions with certain restrictions about how they share information in terms of encrypting it and only sending it to on a need-to-know basis, control more over shipping materials and equipment. Physics has lived with this for a long time. MIT has a special lab called Lincoln Labs. People don't publish out of the Lincoln Labs unless they get a clearance from the Department of Defense. They deal with dangerous information there about how to make weapons. You could set a system up like that for synthetic biology. In addition, scientists say to me, but we can't restrict information. That's unscientific. It can't be done. And then they go and apply for a patent and wait 4 years to publish. I mean, restriction on information is done for commercial purposes all the time. You could do it for national security if you wanted to. I'm not saying we should, I'm not saying we shouldn't, I'm just saying if you really want to control misuse, there are some things that could be done to try and minimize misuse of synthetic biology. So everybody follow that. We can make organisms that are frail, we can make organisms that die, we can try to make sure we know who's in charge to enforce rules about where they can be made. We could even restrict who knows how to make certain things. That would make a response to how do you minimize the risk. So what I want to finish up with is trying to address that is life special argument. Playing God. It turns out, as I've said, all major religions that I'm familiar with accept the idea that we're going to manipulate nature, that humans can breed animals, grow plants, have agriculture. In fact, as far as I know, all the major religions of the world also accept a different kind of intervention, medicine. We kill bacteria mercilessly. We vaccinate ourselves. They can't eat us, they want to. They wish they could, they can't. So we do many things in nature that clearly manipulate it. So the principle that humans should not try to manipulate or change nature is too strong. In fact, no religious group has also come out and said, you know what, when we genetically engineered seeds and plants, we oppose that. The playing God argument about genetically modified food or seed only comes from secular people, not religious people. They make the argument about don't play God when it comes to food. And in fact, when we did our 1999 paper and surveyed 4 or 5 major religious traditions, the Sunni tradition, Catholics, we had Jews, we had Hindus, one other one I can't remember, evangelical Protestants, no one said we have an in-principle objection to making new life forms. Now, I'm not saying we couldn't find somebody who did. Maybe somewhere someone could issue a fatwa that said I don't approve, but in general, no organized major push from religion not to do this. Maybe it'll come, but it certainly hasn't appeared yet. So I said, I don't think it's the God part, I think it's the playing part. And I don't think we should be out there playing around with this. I think we should justify taking risk that something could escape or something could have an engineered life form that we thought we understood but did something we didn't really expect it to do. But it better be for a pretty serious purpose. Here's some things that synthetic biologists have talked about in books and articles recently. How about bringing back the Siberian tiger and the woolly mammoth? That might be fun. We'll make their genome. We don't have genomes of these animals right now, but we can reconstruct them perhaps from their bones and remains and take a stab at what might be the genome of a woolly mammoth. My friend George Church, in a recent book, who's working on bringing back the passenger pigeon, I'm not sure the world needs this animal, but he's trying to bring it back. There must be certain pigeon fanciers somewhere that mourn the passing of this thing. But he suggested in his book, how about we bring back Neanderthals? The Neanderthal genome right now is just a string of DNA letters that have been pierced together from bones from 40,000-year-old samples and stored in computer databases. But you could assumedly transfer that information out, mimic the genetic code with it, and try to create a reborn Neanderthal. So this is all fun. The press was full of this discussion. You remember this discussion a couple months ago about should we make Neanderthals and Neanderthal people, and there are obviously some wisecracks that you didn't have to make them. All you had to do was go to the United States Congress and you could find them. I made that wisecrack a couple of times. But nonetheless, we could, so say synthetic biologists, jigger up a human genome from scratch out of these samples, try to fill in the missing letters and take a stab at making one of these things. Well, this is playing. Does the world need one of these creatures to be restored? Do we need to have the woolly mammoth back? Why not? Well, for one thing, the chance of a mistake in terms of reconstructing the genome is high. And as I've already told you, it doesn't take too many errors in a genome to make a dead thing. That's trouble. When you make a genome and you put it in a human egg, the genes have to talk to the contents of the egg. What an old genome from a long extinct Neanderthal would have to say genetically in its messages to a new human egg is a potential for information transfer trouble in making a defective, deformed, or sick entity. In Spain, there's been a recent effort to restore the ibex, an extinct form of the ibex. Scientists created 439 eggs from living ibexes, and they put in, as best they could guess, what the genes were by engineering them. Of the extinct one, 57 developed into embryos, 5 made it to full-term pregnancy, 1 was born alive. Those are not odds that you want to take in making Neanderthals. You can't have a death rate like that. And between cloning and genetic engineering, the chance of failure is huge. Remember I told you, it's much easier to do experiments to try and make new life forms that are viruses and feel sad that some of them die than it is to make the ibex and feel very sad that some of them die, or to try and make a Neanderthal and have hundreds of surrogate mothers carrying these things to try and produce one with stillborns and malformed entities resulting. For what end? Curiosity? Amusement? Speculative exploration? Remember I said it's the playing part that bothers people. If you made a Neanderthal, is there any reason to think that the 40,000-year-old creature has an immune system that would be up to what the bugs are and viruses that are around today? I would say probably not. What are we going to feed it? Whatever it ate is not abundant in terms of what the plants look like or foods that it ate from then. If you make one of them, who's it hanging out with? I mean, really, if you have it as a child, how are you going to socialize it? Does anybody here know whether the new Neanderthal would actually like public television cartoon shows? Or whatever we choose to socialize this poor thing with? You're basically creating a freakish entity, an object of curiosity, someone that would be perhaps more akin to trying to make an exhibition than a serious effort at science. If scientists talk about and don't condemn conversations when they turn to, hey, why don't we recreate Neanderthals? Or why don't we recreate mammoths? Or whatever it is, then they open the door to the criticism that they can't be trusted because they're playing with powerful techniques. It's one thing to say, trust me, I want to make a bug that's going to make fuel. I want to make a bug that's going to cure your heart disease. It's a very different thing to say, trust me, I want to make a Neanderthal. And my technique's pretty cool and I bet I could do it. I mean, that's all right if you're in 7th grade. It's not a stance that you can take publicly in books and articles and in the media and say, yeah, that's some of the stuff we want to do. You do it, and you're going to frighten the world away from a very beneficial and potentially wondrous technology. So when I say, should we play God, I want to say it again, you don't play. You have to be responsible. You have to lay out the purposes for which you're going to undertake it. Somewhere between avoiding the objection that you're playing God and avoiding the requirement that you follow the precautionary principle comes the responsible explanation of exactly what it is that you want to create, why you want to create it. And I've asked Craig Venter this 100 times. It's nice that he made a living bacteria from a new genome, but what was the point of that experiment? Part of it was just playfulness. And that probably doesn't have a big role in rolling out this new technology. So at the end of the day, to recap, we have a powerful technology in our hands and it's easier to use it, understanding our genes, for many purposes with microbes and less lofty living things than us. We have thought for a long time about the ethical challenges that this area poses. Recently, some groups have begun to comment on it, but they haven't said enough. We don't right now have an international agency or in countries a particular agency that says synthetic biology and the making of those bugs is on my portfolio. I watch for environmental impact. I am sure they are branding organisms so that I know who made them. And if they go somewhere, I can detect it pretty quickly, and I'll find whoever it is that didn't control where these organisms are. I'm going to ensure as a regulatory agency that the things are frail, can't live in natural environments, can't live in us, and are engineered to not live a long time. We'll just make more of them. And we're in a situation where, if you looked out ethically, some would have us follow precaution, which would say, don't do it at all because there's some risk. But if we don't get the oversight and some of the safety mechanisms, particularly about using it for weapons and so on, into place, I think the precautionary principle may win out over reasonable prudence because we're not being reasonably prudent. One way to undermine reasonably prudent behavior in a fundamental way is to talk irresponsibly, to talk playfully, to treat lightly, literally probably the most powerful 21st century technology we've got to take on a series of problems that look intractable, but synthetic biology might take us towards solutions to many of them. But it's not a subject to play with. It's not a game. It's a very serious area. I know scientists like to be playful. I think we have to start to think harder about what we're joking around about, what we do as speculation, what we do as science fiction, how we show off to the world and say, we could make that. We could bring that back to life. Pretty cool, huh? That isn't the message that you want to send around the technology. It's not the way to let the technology proceed. So I hope I made the case that I think we should be proceeding. I think we could do it in ways that are responsible and tried to give you some points about how to make that happen. So let me stop there and see if you have any questions, comments. I'm very open to agreement. You can stand up and say, that's right, I'm out of here. I'll take that. So thank you.
My question to you is this, you brought up on two of your slides there the liability of the reduction to the level of genes, producing life. Could you explain that more?
Okay, I jumped just for interest of time, but what I was saying is sometimes we send the message to the world that there's nothing more out there than our genes. Our genes are us. You see it a lot in genetic testing now where people say, I want to understand disease, I want to understand health, so all I'm going to study are the genes involved in human health, to make this point more concrete. Not too long ago, we had a woman come in who wanted to get tested for the breast cancer gene. She was very worried about getting breast cancer. Her mother had had breast cancer, and she wanted that gene test. We gave her the gene test. She did not have the particular mutation associated with the disease. She felt relieved. I felt horrified, because the woman also smoked 4 packs a day and weighed about 260 pounds. Those are overwhelming risk factors for breast cancer. Genes are great. I love genes. I have some. I like them. I've produced a few offspring with them. But we are not just our genes. We have other traits and attributes that are important to our understanding and in intervening in the world of health and so on. There's no one that's a bigger proponent of synthetic biology, I think, than me, but I don't want us to just think that the only road to solving pollution is to engineer bugs that eat it. I'm perfectly happy to say we should make less of it. So, working across the board is all right. So I don't want us to get into a kind of genetic reductionism. That's what that argument was about. It's very important. It's a powerful area. We're learning it. We're excited about it. But as the lady with the breast cancer risk showed, 10% of breast cancer is actually associated with a genetic mutation. 90% of breast cancer is lifestyle and environment. Can't forget that when you're looking at genes. They're important, but there's more going on than just that.
It's a definition question. So at what point would you consider something a newly synthesized life form? At what point is it just genetic modification of pre-existing life forms?
But it's funny, when Craig Venter announced he had made a new life form, I said, I think you have. He had basically synthesized an entire genome and got it to take over the mechanism of a bacteria from which all the genes had been taken out, and he put his in like a transplant, and lo and behold, the bacteria started jumping around and doing bacterial things. Some people said, that's not it. Until you can make all the cytoplasm and other mitochondria, other components of this thing, you haven't made a new life form from scratch. If you can put something under the direction of a set of genes and get it to really function 100% in a novel way or a way that we've never seen before, I call viruses life forms, and they're parasites. They live off of other things. When you move genes like this, if they can self-direct the entity, I think that's enough to make the claim that you've made a new living entity. Now, for the students here, this becomes a very core question. What really constitutes life? How much would it have to do? You could argue that the viruses, since they have to use bacteria to do their thing, are they more like non-living things that happen to be parasitical on living things? But I never worried about a tapeworm. Tapeworms have to live on us. There are plenty of parasites, right? I consider it pretty alive. If any of you have ever seen somebody pull one out of you, you'd say, man, that's like the movie Alien. That thing's pretty alive. It may have to live in me, but to live, but I'm the host, but I think it's alive. So it is partly a philosophical dispute, but to me, self-direction under the control of a set of newly created, if you will, governance instructions, that would be enough for me to make the claim new life form. So I think we've already had it, but technically he didn't build the entire unit, he just built the brain of the thing and moved it in and had it come to life. I kept trying to explain to people, think of this as a human experiment. If I had a body and I pulled the brain out of it, and then I put a new brain in and it started to jump around, have we made a new living thing? If you answer that intuitively yes, then I think that's what the gene equivalent is of the Venter experiment moving the genetic instructions. So I'm there. I don't care if he cheated and used the rest of the apparatus.
I was wondering, with synthetic biology, what happens on the other end of the scale when you introduce a human being with substantially better properties? An example would be a human being who doesn't need to sleep. So you get a group of sleepless people who now work 24 hours a day. How do you handle your ethical decision making around that type of improvement?
Those are the only people you admit to NYU Abu Dhabi. Or have teacher, for that matter, I guess. We're not there yet in terms of genetically engineering ourselves to be enhanced or improved or super beings, but I take it that we certainly could face that future. We know that we have started to have a debate about, can you run in the Olympics with artificial limbs, which are a version of a kind of bioengineering that may give an advantage, and how much advantage would be acceptable. My general restrictions on what you're asking about is this. First, I think in making people, we want to make them healthier. We may even want to make them smarter or stronger or other traits that we desire. But I don't think we should take away their ability to be who they want to be. So what I mean by that is, I believe that each person has the right to, in a sense, pick their future. And if you just made them so they could only play the violin, but play it really, really well, you've narrowed down their opportunities and choices too much. So I'm a little more comfortable if I said, everybody's going to get a little bit more memory or a little bit more language acquisition skill through these gene changes. I'm not quite as happy if you said, I engineered you to be a mathematician or a chess champion, and you're not. Something went wrong, and this is the worst disappointment I've ever faced, plus that's all you can be. That's all I want. That's projecting too much of my values onto my child's ability to be who they want to be. Now, one thing I do have faith in is no matter how hard we engineer them, the children will rebel anyway. So I'm not even 100% worried about this. No matter how enhanced, they'll be like teenagers. They'll go nutty. They won't follow anybody's orders. So I'm not sure we're ever going to really get to the thing I fear the most, which is that narrowly engineered human. But I'm not opposed to all attempts to make people a little bit better, as well as to deal with their health. I can see for some of us, if we got a little bit better, in my case, at musical aptitude, that wouldn't hurt. It might help a little bit. So I don't think all improvement is bad. And nor do we really anyway, because some of what we do with our diet or exercise or other things is intended to improve ourselves. Even the sleep example you gave, there's both ambient, and then there are certainly, people who get machines that make white noises and they try to sleep more deeply and so forth. If we could sleep better, I don't know that we have to make creatures that never sleep, but if we could be functionally better at sleeping, it probably would be something that many would seek. Other comment on this, which is its own future lecture. What we're talking about is opening the door through genetic engineering to eugenics. One thing you have to keep in mind is we're facing a very different future than the past. The past of eugenics was negative eugenics. Kill the inferior people, whether they're disabled or racially inferior, whatever, eliminate them. And it was something done by government as an imposition. Eugenics was usually done, say, in Germany to protect the state, the public health, get rid of inferior people, get rid of disabled people. The United States had a history of this, so did many countries, in fact, of negative eugenics. The interesting thing about what you're asking about in terms of improvement is it's positive eugenics. It's not getting rid of anybody, it's making some people better. And it's not the government doing it, it's us choosing to do it. So it's a very different moral situation. I know people want to say, well, let's look at the past. I think the past is instructive, but it tells us it's probably not going to be the government that tries to get us to make better babies by genetic engineering. It's probably going to be a corporation that's selling us something that says, you really want to just have a baby the old-fashioned way? You want to create it in some yucky uterus? Who knows what the heck's been in there? You're not going to scientifically enhance up the genes so the kid, you know what I mean? You're not a responsible parent. And our company will help you make a baby. So that's where I think the future goes. It's not some dictatorial state saying, let's kill off the feeble and the weak. I don't think it's going to be a different moral fight.
Hi, Tomasz Sinczak, working for an engineering company here in NYUAD.
See, there he is. I mentioned him and then he appears in the audience.
The thing is that I like a lot what you have said and lots of thoughts and all these regulations and so on. I mean, I think I agree with everything what you said. Now the thing is that all these small organisms that you cannot see, they don't care about borders. And I'm not really aware of any regulation that is worldwide, that is accepted by every single country and so on. And one more thing that I guess, or I'm sure that this technology will progress much, much faster than any regulation can be actually put in place. So what do you suggest
Well,
how to do it?
the good news is, if we start having this debate internationally, we have some time to start the process of those regulations. It's not too late. If we wait another 10 years, like I was bemoaning my earlier paper that nobody took as an early warning, I think it'll be way too late, and we're probably then going to rely on self-governance and get into more trouble with irresponsible behavior too. But I don't think the window's closed. Can we get it perfect? No, but if we did branding, we tried to encourage sort of self-destructive, frail creatures, I think we could get pretty far, not perfect, but pretty far down the road. Can I say there would never be an environmental disaster or an unexpected epidemic outbreak due to tiny engineered organisms? I can't, but I feel pretty confident I could make that a minimal chance. But we gotta have the discussion and the rule setting and the regulatory accountability soon. Because the technology really is moving. It's not gonna wait around. And the benefits are so big that it's not gonna be possible to say we're not really doing it. I mean, some countries might. Somebody's gonna be doing this for sure somewhere in the world. Absolutely sure. It's too economically advantageous if nothing else. So you gotta move quick.
Hi, I'm James Smalley. I'm a student here at NYUAD Derby, and thank you for the amazing presentation, really enlightening. I was wondering how to policymakers we can just say how economically viable these kind of, because you talked a lot about different ways like branding, regulation. Like, I was wondering who would foot the bill, and how can we tell, like, governments that it's justifiable to set up these kind of agencies? And also especially when, if countries like the United States set up, like, significant regulatory agencies on issues like this, what stops companies from outsourcing them to other countries, like in East Asia, where there may not be regulatory agencies, where it may be much more financially viable, and then we'll see outsourcing and loss of kind of economic improvement in countries like the US?
So a shorthanded answer is, by teaching scientific integrity and responsibility or having discussions about it at NYU Abu Dhabi, I want to minimize the number of rogue scientists in rogue places. So I take the scientific integrity and responsibility seriously. I don't want scientists to feel imposed upon. What I want them to do is say, give me the regulatory framework that'll let me move. In fact, we were talking about this earlier today. In areas like animal research, we have a pretty strict regulatory system in most parts of the world. Abu Dhabi has one, the US has one, the UK has one. Most mornings when scientists who do research on animals wake up, they hate those rules, hate them. They permit animal research to go on. And if we didn't have them, there's a pretty good chance in Switzerland and the UK and maybe even in the States, it would be prohibited. So regulation, believe it or not, is sometimes the scientist's friend. It just can't get stifling, but it sometimes actually can be constructive to getting the funding and the trust to move the technology. And the scientific community itself shouldn't be waiting for the bioethicists to lay that message on them. They should be actually participating and pushing for it, as crazy as it sounds, who wants to get themselves regulated, but I think in this area they do. How do we make the case? It's a very simple answer to that one. Genetically modified foods. If you want to have the fiasco that we have watched with GMO foods, which I think should be being used to make a greener, more nutritious food supply, not being engineered to make the world safer for pesticide, not being engineered to, well, I'll leave it there. That technology has the potential to do a lot of good to a lot of hungry people all over the world. It was not regulated, it was not labeled, it was not transparent, nobody's accountable for it. The companies have the nerve to sue small farmers when they think they're stealing their seeds. Are you kidding me? There's a case book of how not to behave. And if you want that to repeat with synthetic biology, then don't pass any regulation. Just wait for one of the bugs to go somewhere, watch the world react to it, and you'll be sitting there saying, but I thought we were going to get rid of pollution and have fuels and do other good things. Won't happen. So the case study is sitting right there, right in front of us. We better not repeat that.
My name is Hinda and I'm a geneticist. I work here at the Diabetes Center in Abu Dhabi. So I was just wondering, could you actually expand a little bit more on the ownership and patenting issues that will come with this? I mean, these days, you know, we can even own a gene or patent a modified gene. So in your personal opinion, do you believe that we should be able to own, you know, patent a synthetic life or not?
I believe I should be able to own it and nobody else. It's big money there. I think, more seriously, we're going to see patent and ownership come into play. But what happened in the US and to some extent in other countries is that the patents, I believe, were given prematurely. You should not be able to patent a gene sequence and say, someday I'll figure out what the utility is of this. In patent law around the world, the way you get a patent is not to identify something that's potentially useful and interesting, it's to make the thing. In other words, Myriad, as a genetics company, has a patent on certain genes involved in marking risk for breast cancer. But they didn't make the test, they just saw these genes had the association and said, hey, you know what, that's likely to prove useful someday, so give us the patent, and the patent office did. I think that's the mistake. Until you have the commercial test, until you have a product, you shouldn't be patenting gene sequences. So I'm not against the patents, I'm against issuing them until you see utility. I think the patent office in the early days got confused in the US about what to patent, and when people say to me, but gene sequences, you know, the ones that exist in nature, you certainly shouldn't patent, and even the ones that you synthesize artificially in synthetic biology, I'm going to assume when you get a product that you make some, you know, something that eats plastic or eats cholesterol or whatever it's going to do, absolutely, then you're going to see patents, and I have no issue with that. Strangely enough, patents are not the obstacle to making things available around the world. Poverty is. So the other part of the problem is you want to give patents to give people incentives to make things and so that they can make money selling those things. But no matter what you did, even if you didn't have a patent, if people are poor, they still aren't going to get it. I mean, unless the Gates Foundation appears to subsidize, it's not going to happen. So the issue, I don't think, is patents. It's economic development, probably on that end of access. All right, well, thank you. You've been very generous in hanging around, and I appreciate those questions. They were great.